This essay example, as well as thousands of others, is available in text format on our website for free and without registration. Simply Google Ivy Panda Free Essays.
Introduction. The participation of Canada in World War I had significant impacts on Canadian society, as well as its status as a country. The First World War had negative impacts and some positive impacts on Canada. The question that remains is, do the harmful effects of World War I outweigh the positive effects on Canada? The positive impacts encompass Canada becoming united and the development of the rights of women. Nonetheless, the war led to significant negative impacts such as loss of lives, an economic downtrend, and the generation of tensions involving the Francophones and Anglophones, who disagreed after the emergence of the notion of conscription. Though the First World War had some positive impacts on Canada, the negative impacts were much more significant. Impacts. Rights of women. In 1914, women in Canada were deemed decrepit and emotional. As Cranny affirms, women were not considered persons under the law unless they committed a crime. Even a woman's salary was legally the property of her husband. Justice, as well as fairness, was blind at that time. Attributable to the extant unfairness, women were not given some rights that were given to men, for example, the right to vote. When the Prime Minister tried to enact the Military Service Act that would institute conscription, some people were against this notion. Nevertheless, women promised to support conscription on the condition that he would give them the right to vote. In that case, Robert Borden accepted the offer, and for the first time in the history of Canada, women were offered the right to vote, just the family members of soldiers. However, the right to vote given to women and their support of conscription just worked to disturb the peaceful coexistence in the country as it created conflicts between the Francophones and Anglophones. Similarly, the gaining of the right to vote by women just gave a false representation of the way life was actually like for the majority of women. Despite the right to vote, life persisted as before. It was full of discrimination, unfairness, and injustice against women. Women were considered inferior to men, and they engaged in tasks that would not essentially be valued as high-ranking occupations, for instance, nurses and teachers. United the country. In the course of the period before the war, dealings with Britain existed, with Canada being a territory of Great Britain. The then Prime Minister, Robert Borden, decided to show that Canada was as powerful as Britain and not just a colony. Thus, Canada ventured into the war in favor of Britain. The majority of Canadian citizens wanted to establish their identity instead of being recognized as a colony. Amazingly, the war did not weaken the identity of Canada but strengthened the unity of the people. Canada had ventured into the war as different, small, and disunited communities, but through the war, the communities merged to attain a common objective. Nevertheless, though Canada had seemed united, it was not the case as the conflicts regarding the issue of conscription divided the people and created hostility. Conflicts involving the Francophones and Anglophones. With the support of conscription by the majority, the affiliations involving the English Anglophones and French Francophones, Canadians started deteriorating. The emergence of conscription acted as a hostile wave. As with the issue of conscription, the residents of Canada encountered many crises like the surfacing of conflicts. The Francophones had the conviction that they had a different culture that did not have many connections with that of Anglophones. They felt no link with Anglophones and thus chose to speak out in opposition to conscription. In this regard, the Francophones were considered disloyal and cowardly by the majority of Anglophones. The violent controversy isolated many Francophones from the federal government, which had gone against its pledge of not supporting conscription. Cranny affirms, the issue of conscription and the bitterness of the debate between Anglophones and Francophones have never been completely forgotten. Loss of lives. The loss of lives in Canada in the course of the First World War was incredible. About 60,000 citizens of Canada lost their lives, and more than 170,000 other Canadians were physically and psychologically wounded. In this regard, a number of historians, such as Jonathan Vance, challenged the conviction that World War I was a mark of Canada's coming of age. The historians are convinced that a war that led to the death of tens of thousands and the wounding of hundreds of thousands cannot be taken as a positive force in the history of Canada. They believe that Canadian citizens suffered greatly in the First World War, and a greater significance ought to be attached to this experience. In their opinion, the coming of age acted as a myth in the course of the 1920s, as well as the 1930s, to alter the pain from the war into a more encouraging occurrence. The myth was intended to assist in repairing the nation, since believing in it could signify that losses in the war had served a worthy function for Canada. Economic downtrend. The economic costs of World War I, in devastation and lost productivity, were massive. Canada's debt started before World War I and swiftly shot up due to the warfare. For instance, from 1914 to 1915, about 50,000 jobs for Canadian railway employees were lost because of Canada's railway debts. Moreover, the Business Profits War Act was enacted in 1916, where every Canadian company that generated at least $50,000 was to file an annual tax return to assist in the recovery of the country's debt predicament. After the end of the war, the economy of the nation did not promptly recuperate. Attributable to the war, Canada had to spend more than $164 million every year on payment of its debt, which led to the initiation of income tax. The total amount of debt had escalated to $1.7 billion due to the First World War. Conclusion. World War I had enormous negative impacts and some positive impacts on Canada. The positive impacts include Canada turning into a united nation and the establishment of the right to vote for women. The negative impacts of the war on Canada encompass resentment between the Anglophones and Francophones due to the issue of conscription, loss of lives, and economic downtrend. Therefore, it is evident that although the First World War had some constructive impacts on Canada, the harmful impacts outweighed the positive ones. Hence, World War I had a negative effect on Canada. If you want to find more works like this essay on history of World War I, positive and negative effect on Canada, head over to ivypanda.com. It has a collection of samples with thousands of submissions covering virtually all academic subjects.